What is up, guys? This is Luke Hill for Kit Guru, and in this one we're looking at the Lenovo P620 workstation. So this is basically a high-performance system built around the Threadripper Pro workstation processors. But the specific unit we're looking at is the P620 with the Threadripper Pro 3975WX 32-core processor, 128 gigs of ECC 3200MHz DDR4 memory, and a Radeon Pro W5700 GPU. How much performance can this £6,000 workstation offer, and how well does it cool? Let's have a closer look. But before we do that, if you like what we do here at Kit Guru, make sure you give us a like and subscribe. It really helps us support the channel. Check out the written review on the Kit Guru webpage. That really supports us out too. You can buy a cool t-shirt like this one on our merch store. You can support us on Patreon, and you can just follow us on all the other social media channels. Really helps us and we appreciate it. Let's get back into it. Star of the show for the P620 workstation from Lenovo is the Threadripper Pro CPU. So the particular unit that we're looking at uses the Threadripper Pro 3975WX chip, 32-core model, and Leo did a really good job. As I wrestle the door off here, there is a technique to it, but I clearly haven't mastered it yet. There we go. Leo did a good job at looking at Threadripper Pro in one of his recent videos with a PC specialist workstation, so make sure you check that out. I'm not going to repeat all of the details that he went through there, but fundamentally Threadripper Pro in the 3975WX form is basically akin to a 3970X consumer high-end desktop processor, but you get some changes to the I/O die which are more akin to Epic level features, and you also get some Pro features for workstation users in an office environment, for example. Unlike consumer Threadripper Pro slots into the SWRX8 socket and uses WRX80 motherboard platforms, so that's a key difference. And the reason there is because this allows Threadripper Pro to handle the two key performance benefits versus standard consumer Threadripper. And they are 8-channel memory with up to 2 terabytes of memory support for the capacity versus 4-channel with up to 256 gigabytes for consumer Threadripper. And you also get 128 PCIe Gen 4 lanes with Threadripper Pro versus 64 for non-Pro Threadripper. Aside from additional memory support, extra PCIe lanes and some Pro-level security and management features, Threadripper Pro is fundamentally very, very similar to normal Threadripper in terms of the CPU itself. For the 3975WX, we've got a 32-core chip, 64 threads, that's Zen 2 architecture, and it's built on TSMC 7nm process technology. The boost speed is up to 4.2 GHz and the base clock is 3.5 GHz, and we get 128 megabytes of L3 cache with 16 megabytes of L2 cache. If we now switch our focus to the CPU cooler handling the 280 watt chip, Lenovo actually goes for a dual tower aluminium fin stack version with 5 copper heat pipes in each tower. This cooler actually uses two 80mm fans, which seem a little bit underpowered, but we'll have to see how it performs in our actual testing. The fans use rubber grommets to mount to the heat sinks, which is a pretty smart move from a noise suppression perspective, and you get 4-pin control through the motherboard. Our review unit ships with 128 gigs of DDR4 3200 ECC memory, and this is split as 8 16GB SK Hynix ECC modules that run in 8-channel mode. Despite running at 3200MHz frequency, the latencies are really lax at something in the order of CL24, so clearly you're not really going to get good latency performance here. However, 3200MHz clock speed and 8-channel worth of bandwidth, that's going to give you a really, really high bandwidth number that may just alleviate any of your latency concerns anyway. And thankfully, the Infinity Fabric is running correctly at 1600 MHz, so you're not going to be losing performance there. That's a good thing. The DIMMs are uncooled, which is fine for DDR4. However, Lenovo, for some reason, decides to opt for these disgusting, quite frankly, 40mm fans on top of plastic shrouds to cool each DIMM bank. I have no idea why this configuration is used because DDR4 memory just doesn't need all that much cooling, especially not from an annoying, whiny, high RPM 40mm fan. A better approach would have been just to use metal heat spreaders on the memory modules, as we see with basically all memory modules on the consumer market. Perhaps Lenovo's put this in there for the higher memory configurations of this system, which may produce more heat and more power through the memory section. If you've got 512 gigs in there, maybe you do need cooling. For 128 gigs across 8 DIMMs, you don't need the fans, so that's a bit of an annoyance in my opinion. In terms of graphics card, there are a few different options in the Lenovo configurator, but we got a Radeon Pro W5700 graphics card with our system. This is essentially a professional workstation version of the RX 5700 consumer GPU, so it's using RDNA technology and a Navi GPU, of course. And as we expect, it has pro-level benefits in terms of software support from certain packages. We have done a full review of the Radeon Pro W5700, so make sure you check that out with regards to specs and features. Notably, this is an 8GB GDDR6 VRAM model, so that could be cutting it fine for a workstation of this caliber at £5,500 to £6,000 cost in the UK. But of course, that's going to be very much workload dependent. Just something to bear in mind. Clearly, the card is using a dual width blower style cooler, and I use a single fan underneath. So basically, it's going to be managing itself, especially with this front 80mm fan, creating basically a directed chamber effect. And in terms of connectivity, you get 5 mini DisplayPort 1.4 and 1 USB-C for video output. I would have liked to see more USB-C instead of all those mini DisplayPort 1.4s. However, in a professional environment using this workstation, they're probably going to leverage the mini DisplayPort ecosystem pretty well, so not too many complaints there. Plus, this configuration means you can do 5 4K monitors simultaneously or 3 5K monitors. That's really, really impressive. Lenovo uses the company's own Castle Peak WRX80 motherboard as the base for the P620 workstation. This hefty unit positions the DIMM banks above and below the SWRX8 CPU slot, and this is something that we've seen is quite conventional with Threadripper Pro. The VRM hardware looks to be ample, because you get a pretty hefty set of MOSFETs and chokes positioned either side of the CPU socket, and you get a very well-designed thinned heatsink that's passively cooled, which is a positive from a longevity and from a noise output perspective. The board features 6 total PCIe slots, 4 of which are Gen 4x16 and the other 2 are Gen 4x8. The graphics card is actually positioned in slot 3, and this nullifies 2 X16 slots because of obviously using one and the width of it. You can, in theory, install another 2 graphics cards because you've got 2 more remaining by 16 Gen 4 slots. However, you do get a fan header for this, as I've already mentioned, annoying RAM cooler near the top slot, which is the one you should be using next according to the Lenovo manual. So you are going to have to watch out for interference there. You're basically going to have to remove the RAM cooler, which is not a disaster in my opinion, but it may have some warranty implications. Logically, we can see that some users may be installing a second graphics card in this system. That's absolutely justifiable, and you can spec it like that on the Lenovo configurator page. So Lenovo actually does pre-route some PCIe cables, so you can install a secondary graphics card. That's good. You've got dual M.2 slots positioned in the bottom right section of the motherboard underneath a metal heatsink. One of these slots is pre-configured in our configuration with a 256GB WD SN730 NVMe SSD, and that leaves you one additional slot for another M.2 SSD. Of course, in your configuration, depending on your workload, you're going to have to update the SSDs. That's just not enough storage, but this is the base configuration with regards to storage, it seems. If you're a heavy storage user and you need high-speed access, you can leverage a PCIe add-in card, and you could put, I don't know, a single M.2, double M.2, triple, or even quadruple M.2 slots into one of those add-in cards. And this is good because you get plenty of PCIe connectivity on the Threadripper Pro platform, so you don't have to worry about stealing lanes from elsewhere. You also get 6 onboard SATA ports to connect up optical disk drives, for example, or hard drives and SSDs in SATA form. And 2 important inclusions are an internal USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type A header, which is fantastic for putting license keys on flash drives inside of the system. And then you also get a Thunderbolt add-in card header. So if you do want to go down the Thunderbolt ecosystem, you can buy an add-in card. Power is fed to the system via a 1000 watt 80 plus platinum power supply. So this is a multi-rail unit, and according to Lenovo's online page, is up to 92% efficient. A single fan is used to cool the power supply, and it's fundamentally in its own dedicated zone, more or less, so it'll just handle its own cooling. And given that the single connector actually feeds power directly to a slot on the motherboard, we don't really see any cables coming from the power supply, and this is ideal for the toolless operation. You therefore have some breakout cables on the motherboard, which is distributing the power around the system, and you get two breakout connectors for the PCIe cables for graphics card 1 and graphics card 2 in a high power configuration, and you also get another breakout connector for the SATA cables to connect some drives. This is a pretty good approach in my opinion. I quite like the system, and it keeps the power supply, which has quite a heft to it, toolless in nature. I'd say onboard connectivity and I/O is just okay. It's nothing fantastic. You do get 10 gigabit onboard networking on the motherboard, and that's through an Aquantia AQC107 NIC, so that's good to see. However, I would have liked at least one more network card, because dual network interfaces is really good for redundancy in a workstation, even if it was just 1 gigabit. You can buy an add-in card, Aquantia 10 gigabit NIC, additional on the configurator, but that costs about £80. Probably worthwhile, but it is a cost, of course. And then around the rear I/O, I would have liked to see a few more USB Type-A ports and at least some Type-C connectivity on the rear. That's a bit of a disappointment there. However, the front panel I/O is very good in my opinion, with 4 10 gigabits per second USB ports, 2 of which are Type-A and 2 of which are Type-C. That's fantastic. The chassis is actually a genuinely really compact design given the amount of horsepower squeezed into our configuration and the amount of horsepower you actually can squeeze in. And I will say that the system is very easy to manhandle thanks to this excellent handle on the front and the overall sturdiness and pretty good build quality in our opinion. Sticking on the topic of cooling though, you only get a single 80mm intake fan and a single 80mm exhaust fan. Now this is fine for our configuration because the CPU has fans to handle itself. For some reason the RAM has fans to handle their cooling, whatever. The GPU obviously has a fan to handle its own cooling and the power supply has a fan. However, with some of the configurations you can spec for this workstation, especially an additional high power graphics card, single 80mm intake, single 80mm exhaust, that's not really ideal. I will say that the toolless design is superb. You can get the RAM coolers off without needing a screwdriver. The same goes, for example, for the hard drive trays and the power supply. And you can also spec a version of this system that has a key for the side panel to prevent any unauthorized access. Plus, I did find the inbuilt speaker genuinely quite useful, especially when you plug it into a monitor that doesn't have speakers or when you're away from your normal workstation setup. So if we summarize the overall system before moving on to the testing, we've got the 32-core AMD Threadripper Pro 3975WX processor. We've got 128 gigs of 3200 megahertz ECC DDR4 memory in 8-channel mode. We've got a Radeon Pro W5700 8GB GDDR6 VRAM graphics card. We've got a 256 gig WD-SN730 NVMe SSD, and we've got a 1 kilowatt 80 plus platinum power supply. Of course, as I've already mentioned, this is just a base storage configuration, so you're almost certainly going to have a different storage configuration if you were to consider buying this, but that's down to your own personal preferences. The review unit comes in at just under £5,000 including VAT in the UK, and that's with Windows 10 Pro, but that's excluding the graphics card because currently this one doesn't show up on the configurator. So if we had about £900 cost for the graphics card despite it being $799 US MSRP, graphics card pricing at the moment is terrible. We're talking about £5,500 to £6,000 in the UK, including VAT. And that does include a 3-year on-site warranty for the workstation. Of course, there are other options available through the configurator, 12, 16 or 64-core Threadripper Pro CPUs if you want different memory setups, definitely different storage systems and alternative graphics cards. But this is the system we've got, so let's have a closer look to see how it performs. Let's have a watch of 64 compute threads ripping through Cinebench R20 with the Threadripper Pro. Now that is pretty quick, over 16,000 points. Now 7-zip is one of those areas where we are likely to see big benefits from the 8-channel memory. So if I just get the 7-zip benchmark running, hammering the CPU, hitting the 8-channel memory pretty hard, we should see some gains. So we can see quickly, we can see the resulting speed for the decompressing is about 328,000. That's very good, but comparable to conventional Threadripper. But what we see is the compressing score, which does rely heavily upon memory bandwidth. That's a pretty astronomical 237,000 or so. And you'll see the exact figures with repeated testing in our charts. But what I can say is this is monumental, and it shows the impressive bandwidth potential of 8-channel 3200 MHz DDR4 for Threadripper Pro. Cinebench R20 has the 3975WX in Lenovo's P620, scoring just over 16,000 points in multi-threaded and the 500 points typical of Zen 2 for 1T. For reference, Cinebench R23 nets 41,000 multi-core points and 1282 for the single core. Blender Classroom also puts the P620 close to the PC Specialist Threadripper Pro system and slightly behind the better-cooled non-Pro Threadripper comparisons. For reference, the Radeon Pro W5700's GPU compute time was 231 seconds, and that's over 82 seconds slower than the 32-core CPU. Another couple of tight scores are seen between the two Threadripper Pro 3975WX systems in Handbrake, though the H.265 test was a little slower on Lenovo's P620, which is likely attributable to clock speed consistency for the long run. 7-zip decompression falls in line with our expectations and shows a solid result, but the compression numbers are supreme and chart-topping, thanks to the excellent memory bandwidth from DDR4 3200MHz DIMMs in 8-channel mode. Another off-the-chart score is shown in the Ada memory bandwidth test. Lenovo clearly nailed it when it comes to raw megabytes per second from the memory configuration. Latency is not so positive though, which is understandable given the ECC configuration's lax timings. The WD-SN730 SSD is certainly not the fastest drive on today's market, and it's not even PCIe Gen 4. It does, however, prove solid enough for OS duties, and cooling from the Lenovo heatsink is not a concern with our tested peaks staying well below 50 degrees Celsius. In terms of system temperatures, the CPU was just shy of 90 degrees Celsius after 30 minutes of heavy load, while the GPU chugged away at 75 degrees Celsius or 90 degrees Celsius hotspot at the same time with the same 30-minute load procedure. The recorded noise output for simultaneous CPU plus GPU load-in after 30 minutes was around 48 to 50 dBA. We run Blender Classroom on the CPU. Let's have a look at some of the system behaviors. So firstly, we can see the wall power ramping up. It's already at about 369 watts, so just under 370 watts. And of course, this is a 280 watt TDP part, and with Threadripper Pro, that means you will actually deliver 280 watts, so none of this mainstream difference behavior that we see with TDP. Now we can hear the fan ramping up, and this is specifically a CPU only load at the moment. So we're running at kind of 80 degrees Celsius CPU temperature, and that is increasing slightly, about 3.6 gigahertz on all 32 cores. And our wall system power is approaching 380 watts for the CPU only load on the system. And we're still at about 380 watts system load. The CPU is still running at about 3.6 gigahertz, just under 3.6 gigahertz, and our temperatures are kind of mid-80s. And the CPU fan is definitely noticeable and quite loud, but not too over the top, which is a good thing. We've been running this heavy CPU plus GPU test for somewhere in the order of about 5 minutes. The noise level is currently about 48 to 49 to 50 decibels from the system, from about 30 centimeters away. And if we look at the GPU clock, it's around about just over 1700 megahertz on average, about 1710 or so. The CPU is still running comfortably at about 3640 megahertz. The temperature for the CPU is about 90 degrees Celsius, and the GPU is happy at kind of high 70s on the GPU temperature and in the order of 90s on the hotspot temperature. So cooling wise, we're all perfectly happy here. The noise output is, once again, not too in your face, but certainly audible. What we can hear now is the system under idle conditions, so pretty low on the fan speeds, but I want you to listen out for that rumbling kind of pulse, heartbeat type noise, which is quite annoying to my listening experience. If we close this one out then, the Lenovo ThinkStation P620 is clearly a workstation designed for users who need a hefty amount of CPU horsepower, plenty of high bandwidth memory, and lots of PCIe connectivity. And with Threadripper Pro, the P620 does deliver on those goals. The 3975WX CPU proves just as pleasing to use for heavy compute tasks as its non-Pro 32-core Threadripper brother. And the fact that Threadripper's key downside, memory capacity, has been addressed on the Pro version with 2 terabytes capability and octa-channel support, that is a key positive. There are some clear pros and cons for the Lenovo ThinkStation P620. Firstly, Lenovo's decision to use 3200MHz ECC DDR4 memory is a very good one, not only because it gives you plenty of high speed, high bandwidth memory capability, but it also allows you to run at 1600MHz Infinity Fabric on the Zen 2 processor, which is ideal. I also appreciate just how compact the chassis is. The front I/O is excellent, but the rear motherboard side I/O, not so much. And the fan curve is clearly well designed for removing the noise output once a load is taken away from the system, so that's good. There is, however, the caveat that noise levels are a bit higher and a bit more irritating than I would have liked, and that's just a caveat and a compromise of the small form factor chassis, and it's to be expected when using 80mm fans. And don't even get me started on those RAM coolers with their silly 40mm fans. I don't want to see those ever again in the system, quite frankly. Expansion options for the P620 are reasonable, with an additional graphics card, a network adapter, and a SSD RAID controller, for example, being likely additions. However, there's absolutely no denying that a system built around a DIY-focused, physically larger motherboard, such as the Asus Pro WRX 80 version, is going to have far superior expansion capability. And that's especially true for users who want triple or quadruple high bandwidth graphics cards with minimal compromise to the storage and networking ecosystem on their high performance workstation. The Lenovo P620 does fall short in that regard because it doesn't really allow you to properly utilize all 128 PCIe Gen 4 lanes from the Threadripper Pro processors. So even standard Threadripper with 64 lanes probably would have been sufficient here. That's a bit disappointing from Lenovo, to be perfectly honest. Oh, and post on the P620 is ridiculous at about 1 minute of heavy fan whirring before we even see any signs of life through a connected monitor. Compared to the PC Specialist Sentinel Threadripper Pro system that Leo reviewed, the performance from the Lenovo system is quite similar. The P620 offers a far superior memory configuration, a more compact chassis, a very good toolless design, and a proper pro-grade graphics card. PC Specialist's similarly priced workstation, however, offers stronger cooling capability, far superior expansion options, a better I/O system, and a fundamentally more powerful graphics card, albeit a prosumer, not a pro-grade model. This is not really a comparison between those two systems though, because they both have their pros and cons, and they both have their positions in the market for different buyers. Plus, they both show off the sheer versatility and raw horsepower of the Threadripper Pro processors pretty well. Overall, I think Lenovo's done a good job with its P620 workstation. It's not all smooth sailing, but this is a workstation that I would be happy to use as my daily system as an employee of an engineering, manufacturing, 3D rendering, artist or simulation company, for example. I'd be happy to use this day to day, and that point is especially valid if the company, which is typically limited to HP, Lenovo or Dell due to the purchasing agreements, was paying the hefty price tag for the P620. Clearly, Threadripper Pro in the 3975WX form delivers in the P620, and it delivers well. Just make sure your boss signs off on that purchase order when you're requesting one of these bad boys. I've been Luke Hill for Kikaroo. Thank you for watching our video review of the Lenovo P620 Threadripper Pro workstation. Let us know what you think in the comment section down below. Do you quite like the way that Lenovo has configured the hardware? Would the limited upgradability be a problem for you? Do you appreciate the really compact chassis that you can just shove quickly under your desk? Let us know in the comment section down below. If you like this video, give us a like, subscribe, do all that YouTube stuff. It really helps us support the channel. Check out the written review on the Kikaroo website, that really supports us well. Check out our Patreon, our merch store if you want a cool t-shirt like this. Chat with us on Discord, and catch us again in the next one.